Can't talk about democracy without talking about mustering the courage to think critically for yourself. And in fact, in all honesty, that line in the Greek says the unexamined life is not a life for the human. For the human. Our English word human derives from Latin humando, which means what? Turn to paragraph 12 of Vico's great New Science of 1744, that last edition. Because anytime you talk about wrestling with the question of what it means to be human, the most frightening question, the most terrifying query that one can raise to oneself, you have to begin with that Latin humando, which means burying. Burying. We are featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces, who often bury our dead, as they, like us, become the culinary delight of terrestrial worms, echoes of scene 5 of Shakespeare's Hamlet with Yorick's skull. And the grave digger being the only one who can go head-to-head and toe-to-toe with the most sophisticated philosophical protagonist in the history of all modern Western literature, Hamlet himself. He's finally humbled by the grave diggers in that scene, Act 5, right? Because he has to deal with questions that we have to deal with this very moment. Who are you really? What do you see when you look beyond the physical phenotype in the mirror? What is the quality of your character, the depth of your virtue? Get beyond the mask that you wear, the social role that you play, the larger societal function you may exercise. Who are you as a human being? Of course, this question is so very important this month, February, because February is about what? It's about the history of a people who have had to ask themselves over and over again, what does it mean to be human? Because their humanity has been systematically called into question for over 400 years with the major authorities in the culture, science, church, mosque, synagogue, journalism, mass media across the board. We've done better in the last 50 years, but for 350 years the record didn't look too good. In fact, the very discovery that black people are human beings is a new one. You have a long-term perspective, centuries, on behalf of those who subjugated them. So this question of what it means to be human affects each and every one of us, and that's why all of us have so much at stake in black history. And yet at the same time, when we accent the specificity of these people's struggles, we see what? They begin on a Socratic note, that we are going to be highly suspicious of dogmas that are hidden and concealed. Dogmas like white supremacy, denied, evaded, avoided, act as if it's not there. Like the U.S. Constitution, no reference to the institution of slavery, right? That's called denial. It's called avoidance. It's called evasion. The hypocrisy would become too overwhelming. So the founding fathers and all of their wisdom, and I give them great credits, they were unbelievable guerrilla fighters against a vicious British Empire and the oppressive George III. But they didn't want to deal with certain dogma. They were too parochial and provincial when it came to certain dark realities, certain realities that it was better to somehow hold at arm's length. And that's true for each and every one of us. Who are you really? What kind of dogmas operating in your life and in the community from which you come such that you don't want to contest it, you don't want to engage it, you rather just skate through life and history and go through the motions? Well, the Socratic note won't let you do that. Socrates goes on to say in line 24a of Plato's Apology, Parasia is the cause of my unpopularity. Parasia, bold speech, frank speech, candid speech, got Socrates in trouble. Right? We can speak to ourselves and speak to each other. Do we have the courage to do it boldly, frankly, and self-critically? Democracies decay and decline when citizens no longer are willing to muster the courage to engage in self-critical reflection and parrhesia, bold speech, frank speech, unintimidated by power. There's no causal connection between them. It's just serendipity or maybe grace if you're a theologian. But you see the point that I'm getting at here. This Socratic note has to do with what kind of human beings one chooses to be. Because a democratic tradition that accents decency and dignity, freedom and equality, excellence, even elegance in certain instances. Very much about the choices that human beings make and how those choices are connected to trying to shatter narrow forms of provincialism, fundamentalism, whatever that fundamentalism is. Not just religious fundamentalism. It could be free market fundamentalism. It could be secular fundamentalism. All circumscribing our horizons in such a way that it makes us difficult to entertain alternatives to them, as if the dialogue is closed. The discussion is trumped. Democracy is all about dialogue and discussion and critical exchange. Bold speech, frank speech, but rooted in that humando. And that's one of the things so crucial about black history, too, is that what is distinctive about the history of black people in the United States, that they have to wrestle with the forms of death in the midst of the precious experiment in democracy called America. In so many ways, America, given its sentimental conception of itself and oftentimes its excessive forms of self-congratulation and self-celebration, we are in such a moment right now, hyper-patriotism that is suspicious of critical patriotism. The flag that Martin Luther King was carrying, the flag that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was carrying, may have different symbolic meanings than the flag that some of our fellow right-wing brothers and sisters might be carrying at the time. Same flag, meaning something slightly different. Maybe attempts to exclude the first group as if somehow they're unpatriotic because they are engaging in parrhesia, critical exchange, and so forth. You see. But the underside, this night side, especially the forms of death, that any civilization that views itself as always already part of the axis of good, a city on the hill that has difficulty viewing itself as engaged in the kind of torturous activities that we saw in Abu Ghraib prison. Such a civilization is a death-dodging, death-denying, death-ducking civilization. You don't want to engage in the darkness. Henry James called a hotel civilization. One reason why he left America. He went to England. Failed playwright. Wanted to write the great drama. Couldn't pull it off like Oscar Wilde, and went to England and wrote magnificent novels. Henry James, what do you mean by a hotel civilization? There's something about these American folk. They're so obsessed with comfort and convenience and contentment, just like living in a hotel where the lights are always on. No darkness, no despair, no dread, no suffering, no grief, just Disneyland life, just having fun, smiling all the time, living in so nice manicured, deodorized vanilla suburbs. You know what I mean? As if there's no dark forces that are penetrating and saturating life wherever human beings go, be they in chocolate cities or vanilla suburbs. Who thinks that somehow they can siphon off and demarcate life from death? But so many times, Americans, at our worst, we think we can. Disney World brags about no one's ever died on our premises. What does that mean? It's just fun. But we also know where there is no death, there's no life. There's escape from life. It's fantasy. It's holding at arm's length all of those inescapable realities like death and dread and disappointment and discouragement and disempowerment. Well, black folk enter the new world on its underside. 52,500 voyages of slaves brought over for 400 years. They better come up with a way of negotiating and navigating with forms of death. What was American slavery but social death? No legal status, no social standing, no public value whatsoever, just a commodity to be bought and sold. How are you going to negotiate your humanity when you are socially dead, as it were, yet physically alive and culturally creative? First great American art form, what? Spirituals. Created by who? Persecuted Christians. I say that for my fellow Christians. Especially a Constantinian Christian, those who are very comfortable with around the table of the imperial elites. Constantinian Christians. No, these black folk have to deal with social death for 244 years. So when they sing "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, Nobody Knows But Jesus," they are not talking about Disneyland or Peter Pan-like realities of innocence and purity. They're talking about humanity, wounds and scars and bruises, and still somehow being able to transmit and bequeath certain senses of grace and love to their precious children, even if you can't keep track of them as they are sold from one part of the nation to the other. You say, "Oh, Brother West, why are you dragging in all this past? This is 2004. But I'm talking about a democratic tradition. You see. And I'm concerned about the younger generation. And traditions are not something that you inherit. You have to fight for them. You want to keep them vital and vibrant and strong. You've got to learn how to be stewards of it. You've got to be willing to sacrifice for it. You don't gain access to it by means of osmosis. If you're no longer willing to muster the courage to think critically, then someone will do the thinking for you. Orwellian double think and double talk. Or elites from above. Or your peers who somehow imply certain kind of pressure to push you into certain complacent modes and maybe even cowardly ones. This is not really me. I don't really think that way, but let's go. No, not at all. One of the great things about Sonoma State University is what? Take the Socratic note seriously. It says, the 4 years that I go through this institution, I am going to engage in a quest for wisdom, recognizing I never will achieve wisdom, but one cannot embark on a quest for wisdom without learning how to die. Wrestling with death, not simply as some event that's going to happen to you at the end of your life, but calling into question certain assumptions and presuppositions that you had before you arrived. That's learning how to die. Anytime you surrender a prejudice, that's a certain death. You give up a presupposition, that's a certain death. That's what Plato himself says. Love of wisdom is a meditation on and preparation for death, because it's in that death that your transformation, your paideia in the Greek word. Your education in the deepest sense, the cultivation of yourself and the maturation of your soul, so you'll know the difference between the frivolous and the serious, between the superficial and the substantive. And you'll get beyond just the superficial, especially the market-driven superficial. I'm here at Sonoma State University because, yes, I want a skill. Yes, I want it done in my job, but I'm also wrestling with the most frightening question: what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a citizen? Because no matter what job I get, I know that I'm still going to die, and I will stay alive before I die by questioning myself such that I can grow and mature no matter what job I have. What is my real calling, not just my career? What's my vocation, not just my profession? What do you want to do with your life? Be a lawyer. What's that? What are you going to do with the law? How are you going to act? I don't want to, the last thing one wants is to be successful. In fact, it's one of the worst things my generation taught young people. We want you to be successful. How impoverished a notion of success. Look at that great essay by that white bluesman born in Mississippi named Tennessee Williams. And his essay, The Catastrophe of Success. I said they've got his play just right down the road. If I was getting out early, I'd go see Streetcar Named Desire. See what Stanley and Blanche are up to. I recommend you all to go see it. It closes February 13th. That's the white blues man. He's one of my soulmates. And he writes an essay called A Catastrophe of Success after the glass menagerie. And it applies to each and every one of us. Okay, so what? You do graduate with honors, Sonoma State University. I pay tribute to you. You do go to the finest law and medical school or business school. I'm slightly impressed. Now, what are you doing with your humanity? What kind of person are you going to be with it? If that success is just an end and not a means to something else, then you don't think that spiritual malnutrition and existential emptiness does not await you? To think that somehow you think you can stuff your humanity into your profession and your social function? Try it and see. No. Sonoma State University is about trying to define greatness, not just success. And greatness has to do with being willing to wrestle with forms of darkness and despair, and being willing to die daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, so at the end of every year, no matter what degree you have, you can say, I have been struggling with my own assumptions and presuppositions in order to become a more decent, compassionate, other-regarding person by using my mind as well as my heart and soul. In fact, I'm sure many students here remember that wonderful moment, those many moments when you leave your classroom and recognize that your worldview rests on pudding. You've completely lost your footing across the board. All those assumptions and presuppositions you learned from your family and your neighborhood and your partners and your mosque or synagogue or church, you say, it can't sustain me any longer. This Nietzsche hit me. Darwin hurts. Toni Morrison shook me up. That's called education. That's what paideia is all about. You don't have to agree with Nietzsche. You don't have to agree with Darwin. You got to engage them. You don't have to agree with Kafka. But if you make it through the metamorphosis and then just go off and have a taco at Taco Bell, something's wrong. You haven't been shook up. Where is the intellectual vertigo? Where is the ontological dizziness? That's part and parcel of the Socratic moment. And it has so much to do with democracy. Oftentimes these days we talk about democracy as if it's some kind of debate about narrow framework for public policy. Liberals on one side, conservatives on the other. How impoverished. Let's start with each and every individual human being who is supposed to be a citizen concerned with public good and common interest. Because that's how you lose democracies. Socratic juices run out. Nobody musters the courage to think critically. Nobody wants to speak boldly. You lose it. Because democracy is not mob rule, right? It's not majority rules. Hitler was elected. Majority. That's not democracy. That's gangster activity with a citizenry who would become cowardly, who would become complacent, who would become conformist. There are things that must be in place for the very conditions of democracies to flower and flourish, like Socratic energy and contesting dogmas. Dogmas like white supremacy. Dogmas like male supremacy. Dogmas like class privilege. Not class privilege in the sense of abolishing classes, but thinking that simply because one happens to be born into a particular class, one thinks one is better than somebody else. See? They're born on third base and think one hits the triple phenomena. You know. No, that wasn't you. No, that wasn't you. You're born on third base. I must be a slugger. No, you got to reevaluate this thing. Imperial arrogance. Every empire in the history of the world, going back to the Persian Empire, the Athenian Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, now the American Empire, tends to be seduced by the wine of greed and corruption and hubris, to think that somehow they can shape the whole world in their own image and their interests. And they've seen empires over and over again attempt to do that and fall on their faces, but they figure this is the one we can do. This is the one time human history can do it. Why? Because we're so special. God chose us from all of the different human beings in the world. He chose us to be the pure and pristine empire. You say no. American democracy is great precisely because you have had courageous, compassionate citizens who are willing to sacrifice, to think critically, and also connect with others to ensure that something like the Bill of Rights has substance. Something like working people have dignity. That peoples of color have status that ought to be affirmed. You know what went into that? That's why February is such a serious month, yo. Because when you start talking about Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Martin King, we just lost a great, mighty warrior today with Ozzie Davis. Let's give him a hand. This is serious business. White brothers like Elijah Lovejoy. You all know who Elijah Lovejoy was? 1837, graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, standing on his roof, shot down like a dog. That's part of the abolitionist movement, fighting for free press, affirming Bill of Rights. Lydia Maria Child, a white sister in 1833 that wrote appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans, alongside David Walker's great appeal. That's what makes a democratic tradition strong. And one can go on and on. Asian sisters like Grace Boggs, Jewish brothers like Harry Magdoff, well-to-do white brothers like Paul Sweezy, brown sisters like Dolores Welter, brown brothers like Cesar Chavez, red brothers like Dennis Means. We can go, Russell Means. We can go on and on. It's a human thing. Democratic tradition says what? Whosoever will, let him come. Make a choice. Choose to be a certain kind of human being. You're not locked in any pigeonhole. Not a question what color, class, sexual orientation. Not at all. People of color can be cowardly or courageous. Our gay brothers or lesbian sisters can be cowardly or courageous. Americans, Russians, Lithuanians, Ethiopians, all can be cowardly or courageous. Sounds like platitudes. You'd be surprised when you actually keep track of that on the ground. You'd be surprised. Now, for me, this Socratic energy, which is the first pillar of any serious talk about democracy, must go hand in hand with the second pillar, which is the prophetic moment. Because one of the fascinating things about Socrates, of course, is one, he never wrote a word, and I do not recommend that for students here. So now, stay. Write your papers. Now, don't take Socrates very seriously, but don't imitate him in that way. It's like Christians who try to imitate Jesus and walk on water. Don't start there. Start something else. Highlight something else about it. Socrates didn't write a word. Okay. He ran his mouth. He loved to talk. Still ended up put to death by the Athenian democratic regime. But what is fascinating about Socrates is the only thing we know about him comes from the writings of Plato. Quite profound stuff. Usually wrong, but profound. Probably the most profound we know. Xenophon, more didactic. And Aristophanes, satirical depiction. Socrates in the clouds. Those are the three sources we have for Socrates. One for those three, we wouldn't know anything about Socrates. Right? But never is Socrates ever depicted as shedding a tear. He never cries. You say, well, was he married? I don't say that. No, they engage in things. I don't want to push this too far. Yes, he was. Xanthippe. Did he have kids? Yes, he did. He had 3 kids. Well, how could somebody be married, have kids, live to be over 70 years old, 79 years old, and never shed a tear? Maybe he did. He just wasn't depicted as shedding a tear. But it raises questions, especially for democratic projects, about this Socratic love of wisdom, whether there's a defect there. Because it may indeed be the case that anyone who never sheds a tear has never really loved. And if you've never really loved, it's hard to say you ever really lived. You can't live simply within the confines of your mind. You've got to connect the cerebral to the visceral. You can't live within the confines of your own sophisticated analysis. You got to somehow connect it to some love flowing out of your soul and your heart. And that's why that second moment is so very important. That second moment actually comes out of Hebrew scripture. Tremendous act of Jewish imagination, creation. Of course, the claims are revelation. We can debate back and forth, but it comes out of Hebrew scripture. In which what? To be human is not simply to engage in relentless critique of dogma, like imperial dogma of Egypt vis-a-vis slaves. But to be human is to express hesed, loving kindness, connection to the other, highlighting the stranger and the widow, he or she who has been pushed to the margins. And to be human in the end is to bear prophetic witness in your actions, not just your arguments, not just your visions. It's like the conclusion of an Aristotelian syllogism. It's action. It's praxis. It's not a proposition. It's not a formulation. You see this. Amos 5th chapter, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I won't quote scriptures. I won't quote the Hebrew scripture here. You all either know it or you can hunt it down. But there's no doubt that the till is about what? Justice, justice, justice. And it's profit to the nations. There's nothing narrow, parochial, or tribalistic about it in its injunction. Amos don't speak simply to the Israelites. What you have to say is to each and every nation around the world, and you yourself will be subject to the same kind of critique that any nation and peoples will be. And it begins with what? Cries, guttural cries, wrenching moans, visceral groans. That's how the people come into existence. I heard their cry of affliction. Starts all the way down here with those wounds. It's a very different starting point. It's not just a kind of noble rationalism, but there's a solidarity with those who are catching hell and can't help but cry out. Like that first chapter in the finest 20th century comic novel in the United States, written by Nathan Weinstein, but he's known to the world as Nathaniel West, called Mrs. Lonely Hearts. 1933. The first chapter is about what? Help, help, I don't have a nose and my friends are making fun of me. Miss Lonely Hearts, of course, is like Ann Landers, you know, he's a columnist. Help, my boyfriend is putting me down. Help, my girlfriend's been raped. Help, my people across the way have been tortured. That's the starting point. An acknowledgement of what the great Samuel Beckett called the mess. Being in time and space and a body. You're in a mess. Tears, lament, grief, mourning, sooner or later will hit you. Socrates can't deal with that. No tears. No tears. And of course, for black history, this becomes important. Why? In part because black folk, in dealing with social death called slavery, after slavery, 12 years, multiracial democracy for a while, had more senators in the 1870s who were black than we do now. It's important to keep in mind. Now, we got Brother Obama. He's brand new. We got him. He's brand new. They had two from Mississippi in the 1870s. That was Reconstruction. That was multiracial democracy. America saying, oh, my God, we've been subjugating these people. We've been violating. We have amendments and so forth and so on. Pull back. Here comes civic death, Jim Crow, Jane Crow. Lynching, American terrorism. For 81 years. You see. And these black folk wrestle with these forms of death by doing what? By in part interpreting themselves through those Hebrew scriptures. Yes, we understand that Jew named Daniel in a lion's den. Yes, we understand a Jew named Moses who's leading his people against imperial subjugation. Yes, we understand a Jew named Amos, on and on and on. Even the non-Jew Job, they have an identification with, even though he's in the Hebrew scripture. But they went on to talk about a Jew named Jesus. One of the favorite verses of those people for over 150 years is what? Jesus wept. Socrates argued. Jesus wept. How do you bring those two together? Socratic energy, critical reflection with weeping because you love so deeply and you feel so profoundly. Why did Jesus weep? He only wept twice, right? Lazarus died. And he saw Mary crying. He responded to her tears. And what was it? Second time he wept? He was a country boy, right? Made his entree into the city. Only lasted 3 days, but came into Jerusalem. They gave him a standing ovation when he arrived. And they changed their mind rather quickly. And he wept for their hypocrisy, their sense of frivolity, triviality. They weren't serious about what he was about. And democracies are predicated not simply on Socratic energies of critical engagement and examination of dogmas, but also trying to shape the characters of persons in such a way that whether one is Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or secular or agnostic or latitudinarian or atheistic, you have to have some compassion for something bigger than your own egocentric predicament. You have to be able to somehow make connections across various boundaries. You can't remain tribalistic in any narrow way. You can't remain regionalistic in any narrow way. And in the end, even nationalism itself can become a form of idolatry. If you really don't believe that a baby born in Guatemala or Ethiopia has the same value as a baby born in Los Angeles or Idaho or whatever. That's part of the prophetic juices that ought to flow. And we need this so very badly today, especially after 9/11. Especially after 9/11. Never in the history of the nation have all Americans felt unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated for who they are. It's a new experience for many Americans. Got many white brothers and sisters come up to me, you know, Brother West, I just can't get over this sense of being hated like this. I say, you don't say. Really? Oh. That's a novel thing, huh? Yeah. Just don't like it. I say, my dear brother, to be a nigger in America for 400 years, to be unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated for who you are. So we've got some experience that might be useful. Got some experience that might provide some insight for the nation itself to accent the best of its past and its present. Now that the whole nation in that particular sense has become niggerized, what kind of resources are available for that nation? Will they remain Socratic, self-critical, or will they become self-righteous? Will they remain prophetic, or will they become revengeful? Let's look at certain moments in black history when black folk had to respond to vicious forms of niggerization called terrorism. What did Emmett Till's mother say when she stepped to the lectern when her baby, Emmett, shot down by murdered by American terrorists, Mississippi, August 1955. You all know who Emmett Till was? She brought his body back to Chicago. They said, under no circumstances will we allow the coffin to be opened. She said, this is my only baby. I'm 32 years old, and my husband fought in the Jim Crow army against a vicious xenophobe named Hitler, carrying the U.S. flag, and his baby is now the victim of American terrorism. We're going to keep that coffin open. And they did keep that coffin open in Chicago, didn't they? And 50,000 fellow citizens of all colors, the first major civil rights demonstration 3 months before a black sister named Rosa Parks sat down in order to stand up for justice in December 1955. That's Chicago. And what did she say when she stepped to the lectern? Tears flowing, Socratic juices still at work, looks over the lectern. Her baby's head is 5 times the size of his ordinary head, and the coffin is open. And she says, I don't have a minute to hate. I'm going to pursue justice for the rest of my life. What level of spiritual maturity and moral wisdom and courage to still both critique but also to care and to love went into that statement. She's not isolated. This is a tradition that produced her, that took very seriously the interrogation of dogma like white supremacy, but yet at the same time she refused to get in the gutter with cowardly gangsters who killed her baby, because She didn't have to read Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice to know that the law can be bent one way or the other against Shylock or for him, or against Portia or for him. She didn't have to listen to the quality of mercy speech of Portia that Portia herself was unable to enact. She had already been molded by something else that said, I'm still not going to hate. I'm not going to hunt them down like cockroaches. I'm not going to exercise vengeance and revenge. I'm not going to be Manichaean thinking that somehow I'm purely good and they're purely evil. No, I'm deeper than that. Martin had the same challenge when 4 young sisters in Birmingham were victims of American terrorism. 16th Street Baptist Church, you all know what I'm talking about, September 1963. The only time Brother Martin cried in public. Didn't know what to say. Wondering whether this nonviolence was a hoax anyway. People are going to be killing babies like that. In church, in Sunday school. He looks at the parents. Tears flowing again. What does he say? Somehow we've got to muster the armors of love and justice. It's a great people at their best. Their best. And it's a human potential for any people at their best. They just happen to be couched within the United States wrestling with forms of death. Slavery, social death, Jim Crow, civic death, also psychic death, taught to hate themselves, told they have the wrong hips and lips and noses and hair texture and skin pigmentation. And then spiritual death itself. The very thing that Jesus experiences on the cross. Abandonment by the most powerful forces in the universe. My Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Can't talk about the crucifixion without talking about nihilism and spiritual abandonment. Feeling that there's no connection whatsoever to any of the forces for good in the universe vis-a-vis your relatively helpless situation. And of course, that moment of spiritual death is something that all of us are wrestling with, but we see it in so many ways in our market-driven society among those persons who have very little access to webs of care and ties of sympathy. Very little access to family, very little access to significant others, very little access to loving uncles and aunts, very little access to coaches, just dangling all on their own, and the only thing they can do is become part of an underground industry that somehow connects them with gain activity, thinking that by gaining access to material goods, their inner yearnings will be satisfied and fulfilled. I'm not just talking about young black brothers and sisters, but not a bad place to start. In a society that pushes them to the margins, makes them feel as if they simply do not count. That so many of the powerful leaders of all colors say, we really don't give a damn because we don't put a priority on the decrepit school systems in your urban context, the unavailable health care. We really don't put a priority on the access to jobs with a living wage. We really don't put a priority on the quality of your neighborhoods. Make it on your own and you'll see a racist criminal justice system that targets you and you become the raw stuff and cannon fodder for that prison industrial complex where the private contractors will come in and make money off your labor and you'll become the model of vicious prison activity in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. Same privatized elites in all places, taking over the prisons. 2.2 million fellow human beings and citizens now. 1994 was 1 million. 51% black and brown. Had nothing to do with genetics at all. You put any human being, group of human beings, in situations in which they have very little opportunity, no access to love connection, very little links to webs of care, and you see how they act. You see it in Australia among white working class brothers and sisters pushed to the margins. See it among the Italians when they first get here and people are calling them vicious names. Saw it among Jewish folk when they tried to escape the pogroms in Jew-hating Europe and Russia and so forth, and viewed as already non-Christians and having to go underground with those particular slices. Every community, no matter what, has a slice of those who are inclined toward thuggish proclivities. It never defines the whole community. Never defines the whole people. It's a slice. And of course, the wonderful thing about Sonoma State University is what? You all are open to talented folk across the board. And you also have a sense that when those folk gain access to this place, you're able to keep track of the positive examples of various groups, whoever they are. And if you're not being Socratic and prophetic enough. Time to shatter the stereotype. Time to turn off your TV, where the stereotypes so easily and often circulate. To keep track of what? The humanity of the folk you're interacting with. You see? And it takes a lot. Because any white brother and sister who has been shaped by 244 years of white supremacist slavery and 81 years of white supremacist Jim and Jane Crow, and then another 40 years in which progress has been made, but the stereotypes still cut deep. Any white brother and sister who deeply revels in the humanity, black brother, sister, brown brother, sister, red brother, sister, you undergo a kind of conversion, a kind of metamorphosis and transformation. And you say, God, you know, when Uncle Harry said those things about niggas, he was lying. That just wasn't true. I don't know why he kept saying that. Because I met Jamal, and Jamal is just such a complex, fascinating brother, smarter than me. And he said that niggas couldn't think. So I don't know why Uncle Harry told me that. I'm going to have to give it up, turn it loose. I'm going to have to let that die. I'm going to have to undergo fundamental transformation. And if you get friendships, it even gets deeper, doesn't it? I mean, you could just assign black and white folk together. Why don't y'all stay together for just 2 weeks, every minute of the day? And your whole life will change. God. Letitia, how come they keep following you around in the department store like that? They never did that to my sister. Jamal, how come the police keep pulling us over? I thought they were our best friends. You've been living in the vanilla suburbs, baby. You got to go through this your whole life? Damn. I mean, we laugh, but we know how serious this is, right? This is what I mean by undergoing a metamorphosis. And it works both ways. The black and brown and red folk will undergo a change too. Dang, you know, I didn't know that your mother was so loving, and she's an evangelical too. I thought those evangelicals tried to keep a little distance from Negroes, but she treats me so nice. Be dang. Yeah, people complex. They fall outside of the pigeonholes. Don't get caught in the narrow categories. Keep track of their humanity. This is the challenge. We'll come to a close. We save good time for dialogue. But I do believe that a blues nation can learn something from a blues people, especially since 9/11. How do you keep Socratic and prophetic energies going even in a moment in which you are unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated? Because terrorism is real. No doubt about it. But it doesn't come in only one form. Bin Laden has no monopoly on terrorism. He happens to be a particular kind of gangster. But he was a gangster when the CIA supported him in Afghanistan. He was the same way. Saddam Hussein, particular kind of gangster. He was a gangster when CIA helped supported him. 1979. He was a gangster when Donald Rumsfeld shook his hand and gave him golden spurs on behalf of the Reagan administration. Some of us were marching against him then. So let's be consistent. Don't say all of a sudden he's the embodiment of all this evil. Got to be against gangsterism in whatever color, whatever form, whatever national embodiment it is. That's Socratic. We had to pay a price. We had to bear a cost. And that's why I end on the third note, and we bring this to a close. In addition to that Socratic note and that prophetic note is the blue note. The blue note, the tragic comic note. It's the note of Lucian in the 2nd century, the great writer of Attic Greek prose. It's the note of Jonathan Swift, that Tory anarchist, anti-imperialist, and a priest. It's not an oxymoron. I have to remind our Constantinian Christians, so deferential to the imperial elite. Tragic comic note of the greatest writers of them all, Anton Chekhov. Samuel Beckett, Toni Morrison, of Muddy Waters and Leroy Carr, and Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, and Louis Armstrong, Stephen Sondheim, all of them blues folk. Tony Kushner, blues folk. Tragic comic note. What is that note? It's a note that has nothing to do whatsoever with optimism and sentimentalism. It has everything to do with hope and struggling to sustain that hope. It has nothing to do with narratives that pit the good on one side and the evil on the other, as if the two are not intertwined on both sides, even as you make a judgment as to which side you choose. The United States has magnificent practices vis-a-vis many other nations, no doubt. It's because its democratic tradition still has left its impact. But that democratic experiment still has some deep darkness shot through it. It's just that the other experiments have deeper forms of darkness owing to the relative lack of Socratic and prophetic energies. And the tragic comic note, the blue note, is all about what? How do we ensure that we never give in to cynicism? How do we ensure that we never give up? How do we ensure that misery and bigotry do not have the last word? How do we smile through the darkness and laugh through our tears such that we can continually ensure that the Socratic and prophetic energies are flowing even as we recognize our own limitations? That's what the comic is all about. Being able to laugh at your own incongruities and contradictions even as you are still empowered to think critically, care deeply, and attempt to sustain a democratic order. And in many ways, we are losing that too. And for me, that's the benchmark of what paideia is all about. Not just education, but democratic paideia. You have to have citizens who view themselves as agents, but also view themselves not simply as agents always on the right track, always part of the axis of good, always part of the city on the hill. But no, agents who know that they can make mistakes and fall on their faces and get up and Socratically reflect on why they fail and still have the courage to care for something bigger than their own individual projects. What a challenge. And there's no guarantee. We could be witnessing the American imperial devouring of American democracy this very moment. It's a slow process, very slow process. Marketizing, privatizing becomes these slogans, the cliches across the board. You begin with Social Security, move to Medicare, move to Medicaid, hit education head on. So education is all about just buying and selling and promoting and advertising and making and molding, and no sense of deep nourishing and critically reflection. Everything's up for sale. No democracy can survive in that context. Even parenting itself, the ultimate non-market activity. Parents know what I'm talking about. Once that activity is devalued, then who shapes your kids? The market, TV, mass media. You see. And what are they doing? Is it a healthy shaping? It's not monolithic. There are some wonderful voices in mass media. I don't want to trash any sphere in any homogeneous way. There's some wonderful voices. They're not the dominant voices. Just like mass information. We got Amy Goodman and you got Fox News. You know what I mean? And I'm a libertarian. We all have a right to make fools of ourselves, but there's a big difference. One has big money. The Murdochs and others. The others scrapping. But courageous folks, the Norman Lears and others. He's got cash. He puts it where his mouth is. He doesn't have Murdoch's money. You see, big difference. So I leave you with this sense, especially in Black History Month. Curtis Mayfield said, keep on pushing. That's not optimistic. The Negro spiritual says, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah. It doesn't follow. The glory, hallelujah is a tragicomic moment. You're going to struggle anyway. Cut against the grain anyway. Never view oneself as a spectator, but always as a participant. Never view oneself as somehow outside of the struggle, but always meshed in it. You see, that makes all the difference in the world. And that's the only way we have a possibility of preserving the best of the democratic experiment. But there's no guarantee. Every empire comes to an end. Every social experiment comes to an end. It depends on the quality of thinking and caring and sacrifice of the people and citizenry to preserve the best. What a challenge to us. Thank you all so very much. We'll have a good time for questions. Thank you very much. God bless. God bless. God bless. God bless. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.